Welcome back to the channel, everyone. If you love captivating stories about men transforming into women in unique and fascinating ways, then be sure to subscribe and give this video a thumbs up. Now, let's jump right into today's tale.
Kristin stepped into her apartment, closing the door behind her with a deep exhale that seemed to come from her very soul. She leaned her forehead against the cool wood for a moment, eyes closed before turning the deadbolt with a decisive click. The day had been a lot. Actually, a lot was the understatement of the century. It had been a Category 5 hurricane of revelations, magical explanations, all wrapped in a body that still felt like she was wearing someone else's skin. She leaned against the door for a moment, staring into her home, her new home. The soft pastels, the tasteful artwork, the plants that somehow weren't dead despite being real and requiring actual care. It still felt unfamiliar, even though, according to reality, she had lived here for years. "Home, sweet home," she muttered, kicking off her heeled boots with a grateful sigh. Or at least, someone's sweet home. But at least now she had some answers. Her grandmother had explained everything over the course of the afternoon, detail by excruciating detail, between cups of tea that had gradually given way to glasses of that promised bourbon. By the third glass, the whole turned into a woman. Thing had started feeling less apocalyptic and more like an elaborate cosmic joke. "So I'm a witch," Kristin said out loud to her empty apartment, testing how the words felt on her tongue. A honest-to-God spell casting, potion brewing witch. She glanced down at her hands, half expecting them to be glowing or sparking or doing something remotely magical. They remained stubbornly normal, just slender, feminine, with perfectly manicured nails that she had no memory of maintaining. She pushed away from the door, making her way to the kitchen where she pulled a bottle of wine from a rack she definitely didn't remember owning as Kyle. The label was expensive, French, probably something Kyle would have walked right past in the liquor store, in favor of a 6 pack of whatever was on sale. "At least my taste in alcohol improved," she remarked, grabbing a corkscrew and working it into the cork with surprising dexterity. Her grandmother's voice echoed in her head. "That's the muscle memory, dear. Your body knows what to do, even if your mind is still catching up." Kristin poured herself a generous glass and took a sip, the rich red sliding over her tongue with complex notes she would have completely missed in her previous life. "Okay, that's actually really good," she admitted, taking another, longer sip. Non. Who Kristin Thompson was. Apparently, in this life, Kristin was a designer. And not just any designer, but a damn good one, according to her grandmother. And the memories that kept surfacing like bubbles in a champagne flute. She specialized in high and interior spaces, transforming ordinary rooms into something extraordinary. Her portfolio included upscale Manhattan apartments, Hamptons beach houses, and even a few celebrity homes. Her reputation in the industry was solid, her work highly sought after. She had money, connections, and a career she loved. The evidence was all around her. The tastefully decorated apartment that probably cost more per month than Kyle made in 2 weeks. The expensive clothes hanging in her closet. The top-of-the-line BMW parked outside. I went from analyzing spreadsheets to picking out curtains, she mused, wandering over to what appeared to be a home office area tucked into an alcove. A sleek MacBook sat on a minimalist desk, surrounded by fabric swatches, color palettes and sketches of what looked like living room layouts. She ran her fingers over the drawings, impressed despite herself. They were really good. Detailed, creative, with an eye for balance and proportion that Kyle had definitely never possessed. Kyle couldn't even match his socks properly, let alone coordinate an entire design concept. And as her grandmother had pointed out, with a knowing smile, as she topped off Kristin's third bourbon, that was the luck coming into play. The spell doesn't just make fortunate things happen to you. Gran had explained, her eyes twinkling. It reshapes reality to give you natural talents, skills, and opportunities. You wished for luck in everything, and that meant your career, finances, and reputation were thriving from the moment Kristin came into existence. That's cheating, Kristin had protested, though she couldn't deny the appeal. Kyle had been stuck in a dead end job, grinding away at meaningless reports that nobody read, living paycheck to paycheck in a mediocre apartment with roommates who never cleaned the bathroom. It's not cheating, dear, Gran had replied with a chuckle. It's magic. There's a difference. Kristin had taken another sip of her bourbon. Yeah, the difference is that cheating is usually more subtle. Now, standing in her apartment, her gorgeous magazine-worthy apartment, Kristin couldn't help but feel a twinge of appreciation for this aspect of her new life. Kyle had always been stressed about money, always checking his bank account before making purchases, always choosing the cheaper option. Kristin, it seemed, didn't have those concerns. She opened her laptop, curious about exactly how successful she was. The screen came to life, and she navigated to her banking app, inputting a password that her fingers seemed to know, even if her brain didn't. Holy shit, she whispered as the account balance loaded. The number had so many digits that for a moment she thought she was looking at her account number instead. That's a lot of zeros. She had even kept some of her old interests, which was perhaps the most comforting discovery of the day. She was still a massive football fan. Her apartment might be feminine and stylish, but there was an entire wall dedicated to memorabilia, signed jerseys, game balls, and photos of Kristin at various stadiums. According to Gran, Kristin Thompson was known in her social circle as the woman who could talk offensive strategies better than most men. The one who hosted legendary Super Bowl parties, and the friend everyone called when they needed to understand a controversial call. She still had her fantasy football league, the same one Kyle had been in, with the same friends, though the dynamics had shifted somewhat. And, unsurprisingly, she was absolutely dominating it in this life. Her team was stacked. Her trades had all worked out, and she was sitting at the top of the leaderboard. She navigated to the fantasy football app on her phone, scrolling through her roster with growing amazement. You have got to be kidding me, she muttered, seeing the lineup. Every player she'd selected was having a career year. Her quarterback, who had been mediocre at best in Kyle's timeline, was leading the league in passing yards. Her running back, who had fumbled twice in Kyle's last game, hadn't dropped the ball once this season. Even her kicker was perfect on the year. Kristin had laughed out loud at that when Gran had shown her the stats earlier. Even in a new body, she was still obsessed with football. Some things never change, Gran had said, with a fond smile. Though I must say you're much better at it now. Because of luck? Kristin had asked. Because of intuition, Gran had corrected. Women see patterns differently. We connect dots that men sometimes miss. We consider the human element, who's fighting with their coach, who just had a baby, who's playing through an injury they haven't disclosed. Statistics are important, but they're not everything. Kristin had scoffed. So you're saying women are better at fantasy football? I'm saying you're better at fantasy football as Kristin than you were as Kyle, Gran had replied. And isn't that what you wanted? Some things, it seemed. hadn't changed. Her love of the game, her competitive nature, her desire to win, those core aspects of herself remained intact, just wrapped in a different package. Kristin moved from her office area to the living room, wine glass in hand, taking in the space with new eyes. The furniture was clearly expensive, but comfortable looking. The coffee table held a stack of design magazines alongside the latest issue of Sports Illustrated. A framed jersey on one wall shared space with what appeared to be an original piece of modern art. Best of both worlds, she murmured, settling onto the plush couch. It was far nicer than Kyle's old sagging monstrosity that had been a hand mine. Me. Down from a college roommate. She grabbed the remote from the coffee table, turning on the massive flat screen TV mounted on the wall. Unsurprisingly, it was already tuned to ESPN, highlighting tonight's game. At least, my taste in entertainment hasn't changed, she said, taking another sip of wine as she watched the pre-game analysis. The commentators were discussing a trade that had just been announced. A star wide receiver moving from one team to another after a contract dispute. Kristin found herself nodding along, though understanding the implications immediately, already considering how this would affect both teams' offensive strategies. Then a realization hit her. She pulled out her phone, opening the fantasy app again. Sure enough, she had traded for that exact wide receiver last week, before any public rumors of the real life trade had surfaced. Intuition, she whispered, remembering Gran's words. Or luck. Or both. Either way, it was working. Kyle had been stuck in a losing streak that seemed unbreakable. Kristin was cruising toward a championship. She set her wine glass down, leaning back into the soft cushions of the couch. The day's revelations swirled in her mind like the burgundy liquid in her glass. Being a woman, being a witch, having a completely different life than the one she'd gone to sleep with last night. It was overwhelming, terrifying, completely insane. And yet, Kristin looked around at her beautiful apartment, thought about her successful career, her thriving bank account, her dominant fantasy football team. Maybe, she said to the empty room, just maybe, this won't be so bad after all. At least until she had to figure out how to put on makeup for work tomorrow. That was a crisis for future Kristin to handle. For now, she had a football game to watch, wine to drink, and a life of supernatural luck to contemplate. The rest of the day had been spent in the attic, the same attic she had never been allowed into before. As Kyle, she'd been shooed away countless times when she tried to explore the mysterious upper level of her grandmother's house. Just old junk, Gran would say with a dismissive wave. Nothing you'd find interesting. Dear. Now, she understood why. The place was a treasure trove of magic. Holy shit, Kristin had whispered when her grandmother first opened the door, revealing a space nothing like the dusty, cobweb-filled storage area she'd imagined. Instead, soft golden light filtered through stained glass windows she'd never noticed from outside, illuminating a room that looked like it belonged in a fantasy movie. Ancient books with worn leather bindings and strange symbols embossed in gold leaf lined floor out. 2 ceiling shelves, mystical artifacts, crystals in geometric holders, ornate daggers with jeweled hilts, peculiar mechanical devices that seemed to move of their own accord, were displayed on antique tables. Candles of every color imaginable stood in wrought iron holders, their wicks pristine, as if waiting to be lit for some significant ritual. Crystals in every hue caught the light, throwing rainbow patterns across the wooden floorboards that creaked with age and secrets. Watch your language in the sacred space, her grandmother had admonished, though her eyes twinkled with amusement. Magic responds to intention, and profanity creates unpredictable vibrations. You've gotta be kidding me, Kristin had replied, running her fingers along a shelf of leather. I bound books. You had Hogwarts in your attic this whole time and never told me? This isn't a children's fantasy, dear, her grandmother had replied primly. This is centuries of our family's magical heritage. And frankly, you weren't ready before. And I am now? Kristin had asked skeptically, gesturing down at her very female body. Just because I've got different parts? Because you're connected to the magical current now, her grandmother had corrected, moving to a large oak cabinet that dominated one wall. The feminine energy in our bloodline is the conduit for our particular brand of magic. It's not about anatomy. It's about energy patterns, vibrational frequencies, the subtle currents that run through our family line. Right, Kristin had drawled. Vibrational frequencies. Totally get it? Her grandmother had simply smiled, that mysterious smile that Kristin was beginning to find both endearing and infuriating. You will, in time. There were handwritten spellbooks dating back generations. The paper yellowed with age. The ink faded but still legible. Kristin had carefully turned the pages of one, marveling at the elegant script of what her grandmother informed her was her great-grandmother's grimoire. She was particularly gifted with healing spells, Gran had explained, pointing to detailed diagrams of herbs and roots. Old letters, tied with faded ribbons, contain correspondence between family members discussing magical discoveries, sharing spells, and warning of potential dangers. And even a cabinet that held vials of strange, shimmering liquids, potions, her grandmother had explained, for everything from curing warts to inducing prophetic dreams. Is there one to turn me back into a man? Kristin had asked, only half-eyed, joking as she eyed a vial of swirling blue liquid. Her grandmother had paused, considering her with those penetrating green eyes, the same eyes Kristin now saw in the mirror. There are ways, she'd admitted finally. Magic can be undone. But there would be consequences. What kind of consequences? Kristin had pressed. The luck would vanish. Her grandmother had said. All of it. In fact, given the natural balance of things, you'd likely experience quite the opposite. A significant run of misfortune to compensate for the good fortune you're giving up. So basically I'd be cursed with bad luck? Kristin had clarified. In a manner of speaking, her grandmother had nodded. Magic always seeks balance. Dear. Dansu one. Great power in one direction creates an equal pull in the other when removed. Kristin had fallen silent, contemplating this. Being Kyle again. But with worse luck than before? That was a sobering thought. Her grandmother had explained that only magical beings would recognize the altered reality. A revelation that had initially sent Kristin into a spiral of philosophical questions about the nature of existence. So you're saying reality itself has been rewritten? She'd asked, pacing back and forth across the attic floor, her heels clicking rhythmically on the wood. How is that even possible? Wouldn't that violate some fundamental law of physics or something? Magic operates outside the constraints of conventional physics, her grandmother had replied, seemingly amused by Kristin's existential crisis. Think of reality as a tapestry. We haven't destroyed the original threads. We've simply rewoven them into a new pattern. To her parents, her friends, her coworkers, and the rest of the world, Kristin had always existed. Kyle had never been born. That fact still sat uncomfortably in the back of her mind. like a pebble in her shoe that she couldn't dislodge. So my parents have memories of raising a daughter instead of a son, she'd asked, trying to wrap her head around it. Dad never taught me to throw a football. Mom never complained about my refusal to clean my room. Oh, they did those things, her grandmother had assured her. Your father taught you to throw a perfect spiral when you were 7. You were quite the little tomboy. And your mother certainly had plenty to say about the state of your bedroom during your teenage years. But how can they remember things that never happened? Kristin had pressed. Hi. They happened, her grandmother had insisted. Just not in the timeline you remember. But now, they did happen. That's the beauty and complexity of magical reality manipulation. That's not beauty, that's terrifying, Kristin had countered. You're telling me my entire childhood has been rewritten. Not rewritten, dear. Simply adjusted. Her grandmother had reached for a large crystal sphere on a nearby table, running her fingers over its smooth surface. The core elements remain the same. Your father still taught you sports. Your mother still fussed over you. You still rebelled during your teenage years. The essence of your relationships hasn't changed. Just the context. She had spent hours listening to her grandmother talk about magic, balance, and the responsibilities that came with their family line. How their particular branch of witchcraft focused on luck, fortune, and fate. The subtle manipulation of probability rather than flashy displays of power. We don't go around turning people into toads, her grandmother had said with a dismissive wave when Kristin had jokingly asked about it. That's theatrical nonsense. Our magic is about influencing outcomes, not gross physical transformations, says the woman who turned her grandson into her granddaughter. Kristin had retorted. That was an exception, her grandmother had replied primly. And quite sophisticated work, if I do say so myself. It took considerable planning. Planning? Kristin had asked, raising an eyebrow. So this wasn't just a spur of the moment spell when I complained about my fantasy football team. Her grandmother had looked slightly guilty. Well, perhaps I'd been considering it for some time. The family magic needed an heir, after all. And you always did have the strongest magical potential of anyone in your generation. It was just inaccessible in your previous form. So you've been waiting for an excuse to gender pan. Flip me? Kristin had asked incredulously. I prefer to think of it as waiting for the right opportunity to unlock your true potential, her grandmother had corrected. The fantasy football complaint was simply convenient timing. Kristin had thrown her hands up in exasperation. Unbelievable. And as much as she wanted to freak out, and there was definitely a part of her that was still screaming internally. She couldn't deny something deep inside her stirred at the thought of learning more. When her grandmother had guided her through a simple spell to light a candle with nothing but focused intention, the tiny flame that had flickered to life had sent a thrill of power through her that was unlike anything she'd ever experienced. I did that? She'd whispered, staring at the dancing flame. You did? Her grandmother had confirmed, pride evident in her voice. Your first spell. The first of many. She wasn't sure if it was the magic itself, or just the fact that her grandmother was so happy, but there was something undeniably compelling about this new world that had opened up to her. The idea that she could influence reality, bend probability to her will, tap into forces beyond ordinary understanding. It awakened something that felt strangely familiar, as if it had always been there, dormant inside her. So, what's next? Kristin had asked as the afternoon waned into evening, shadows lengthening across the attic floor. Do I get a wand? A familiar? A pointy hat? Her grandmother had laughed, the sound warm and rich. Such a Hollywood view of witchcraft. No, dear. Next, you continue living your life, your new life, while I teach you gradually. Magic isn't learned overnight. It's a lifelong journey of discovery. But I will get a cat, right? Kristin had pressed. Because I feel like that's non-negotiable at this point. Her grandmother had smiled indulgently. If you wish. Though, in my experience, the familiar tends to find the witch, not the other way around. For now, she was willing to roll with it. What choice did she really have? The reality she had known was gone, replaced by this new one, where she was Kristin Thompson, successful designer, fantasy football champion, and apparently, witch in training. As she'd prepared to leave her grandmother's house, Gran had handed her a small leather bound book with blank pages. For recording your magical experiences, she'd explained. Every witch needs a grimoire of her own. Kristin had taken it, running her fingers over the soft leather cover. Thanks, Gran. Oh? And Kristin. Her grandmother had called as she'd headed down the porch step. Yes? Check your schedule. You have brunch tomorrow with someone named Mike and his friend Jake. Her eyes had twinkled mischievously. I believe Jake is quite looking forward to seeing you. Kristin had groaned, remembering the text notification from earlier. You're enjoying this way too much. A grandmother's prerogative. Dear. Gran had replied with a wink. Besides, I think you'll find that Jake is exactly your type. I don't have a type. Kristin had protested. Not as a woman, anyway. Oh, we all have a type. Her grandmother had said cryptically. Sometimes we just don't recognize it until we see it from a different perspective. With that unsettling thought, Kristin had driven home, her mind whirling with spells, witchcraft, and the disturbing possibility that her grandmother was now playing matchmaker on top of everything else.